I should have never let Silva go into those mountains. That thought would haunt me for a long time. But at the time, it was just another hiking trip. Just two friends, escaping the noise of the world for a week in the wilderness. We had done it before, countless times. But something about this trip felt different. The Cascade Mountains stretched before us, dark and endless, their peaks swallowed by thick clouds. The trailhead was nothing more than a dirt path cutting through towering pines, damp with the scent of moss and earth. The air was crisp, cold even, for early autumn. My breath fogged in front of me as I adjusted the straps on my backpack. "You ready for this?" Silva grinned, slinging his own pack over his shoulder. He always looked at home in the wild, like he belonged more out here than in the city. His dark hair was already tousled by the wind, and his olive skin had that permanent sun-kissed look from years of trekking through places most people wouldn't dare to go. I nodded. "Yeah, you sure about the route, though? Some of these trails aren't even on the map." Silva scoffed. "That's the whole point, man. We're here for the adventure, not a walk in the park." I exhaled, shaking my head with a small smile. That was Silva, always chasing the unknown, always pushing a little further than we should. We started walking. The first few hours were peaceful. The forest was alive with the sound of rustling leaves, birds calling in the distance, and the steady crunch of our boots against the dirt. The further we went, the quieter the world became. No cell service, no roads, no sign of people, just the two of us and the endless trees. At one point, we stopped by a stream to refill our water bottles. The water was ice cold, crystal clear. Silva crouched by the edge, staring at his reflection. "Ever think about how old these mountains are?" he murmured. I looked up from my bottle. "What?" He didn't look at me, still staring at the water. "Millions of years. Before us. Before anything we know." He dipped his fingers into the stream, watching the ripples distort his face. "And they'll be here long after we're gone." I frowned. "You getting all philosophical on me now?" Silva finally glanced up, grinning. "Just saying. Out here, we're nothing. Just specks in the grand scheme of things." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just chuckled and stood up, slinging my pack over my shoulder. "Come on, Socrates. We've got miles to cover before dark." We hiked for hours, the sun slowly sinking behind the trees. The deeper we went, the thicker the forest became. The air felt heavier, quieter. Even the birds seemed to disappear as we climbed higher into mountains. Something about the silence unsettled me, but I didn't say anything, because Silva was smiling, his eyes full of that restless excitement he always had on these trips. And if he wasn't worried, why should I be? That was my first mistake, and it wouldn't be my last. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was just a feeling. The night air was colder than it should have been. We were deep in the Cascade Mountains, miles away from civilization, but I had camped in places like this before. I knew the sounds of the forest at night, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig from some unseen animal. But this night was different. It was too quiet. Silva and I had spent the day hiking up a narrow trail, the kind that felt like it hadn't been walked in years. Thick trees stretched high above us, their bare branches scraping against the sky. Autumn had stolen most of their leaves, leaving only a skeleton of what had once been lush and green. We set up camp near a small clearing, our tent pitched beside an old, half-rotten tree stump. After a quick meal, we sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. Silva was quieter than usual, staring into the flickering light like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. "You good?" I asked, poking at the fire with a stick. He nodded slowly but didn't look at me. "Yeah, just tired." I wanted to believe him, but something in his voice felt distant, hollow. After a while, we crawled into the tent, zipping ourselves inside to keep out the chill. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the branches above us. I pulled my sleeping bag tight around my shoulders and closed my eyes. Then I heard it. At first, it sounded like the wind whistling through the trees. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't just the wind. It was a voice. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came in waves, rising and falling, almost like a whisper carried through the trees. The words were too faint to understand, but the rhythm was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, like someone calling out in the distance. I turned my head and saw Silva sitting up. He was completely still, his face hidden in the shadows. "You hear that?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Then, In a low voice, he said, "It's calling." A shiver ran down my spine. "What's calling?" Silva didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the tent wall like he could see through it. The whispering sound came again, a little clearer this time. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized, but it had a rhythm, like something speaking just beyond the edge of understanding. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Silva, look at me," I said. Slowly, he turned his head. His eyes looked strange in the dim light, wider than normal, almost too wide. "I think I need to go out there," he murmured. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. "No, we're staying inside." He blinked, as if waking from a dream, then let out a slow breath. Yeah, you're right." But I wasn't sure he believed it. For the rest of the night, neither of us slept. I woke up to silence. Not the usual quiet of the mountains, the peaceful kind, with birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. This was different. It was heavy, unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. I sat up on my sleeping bag, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. The tent was cold, too cold, the kind of chill that shouldn't be there after days of sleeping under the stars. My breath hung in the air in faint clouds. "Silva," I called out, expecting to hear him mumble something groggy from the other side of the tent. Nothing. Frowning, I unzipped the flap and peeked outside. Our campfire was nothing but blackened ash, and the morning fog had settled thick between the trees. Silva's sleeping bag lay open, his boots missing. The air was still, no birds, no wind, no distant rustling of deer in the underbrush. Just nothing. I crawled out of the tent and stretched, scanning the area. His backpack was still here, propped against a fallen log. His camera bag, untouched. But Silva, gone. Maybe he wanted to take a leak. I waited, pacing a little to warm myself up. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The quiet was gnawing at me now, setting my nerves on edge. I called his name again, louder this time. "Silva, where are you?" Only my own voice echoed back. Something wasn't right. I checked the ground for tracks, trying to remember everything he had taught me about reading footprints. His boots had left clear imprints leading away from the tent, heading toward the trees. I followed them, the damp earth making the trail easy to read. He'd walked in a straight line, no signs of stumbling or struggle. But then, I stopped. The footprints just ended. One moment, they were there, pressed deep into the soft ground. The next, nothing. Like he had stopped walking and simply disappeared into thin air. My stomach twisted. That didn't make sense. Maybe he had stepped onto a rock or doubled back in his own tracks. I searched the ground in every direction, circling the area, my pulse pounding. No other tracks. No broken branches. No sign of where he could have gone. "Silva," I shouted, louder now, the edge of panic creeping into my voice. The forest swallowed my words. I stood there, heart thudding in my chest, listening. And for the first time, I heard something. A whisper. Soft, distant, carried by the still air. I turned, scanning the trees. The fog had thickened, swirling between the trunks like ghostly fingers. The sound had come from deeper in the woods, but it was too faint to make out words. I took a step forward, then another. Every instinct screamed at me to go back, but I ignored it. My best friend was missing. "Silva, if this is a joke, it's not funny," I called, my voice unsteady. No answer. I kept walking, my breath quick and uneven. The fog curled around my legs as I pushed deeper into the trees. The whisper came again, closer this time, but still too faint to understand. Then just ahead I saw it, a shape in the mist, a figure, standing perfectly still between the trees. Relief hit me like a wave. "Silva, Jesus, man, you scare the hell out of me." But something was wrong. He didn't move, didn't respond. The fog shifted, thinning just enough for me to see more clearly. My relief turned to ice. It wasn't Silva. The figure was tall, its outline human, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And even though the fog obscured most of its details, I could feel it watching me. I took a step back, every hair on my body standing on end. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt locked in place. The whisper came again, right next to my ear. I turned. Nothing. When I looked back, the figure was gone, and Silva was still missing. The morning air was heavy with silence. I stood at the edge of our campsite, staring at the empty space where Silva had been. His sleeping bag lay untouched, his backpack still leaning against a tree. But he was gone. I called his name. At first, just loud enough for him to hear if he had wandered off. Then louder. Then I was shouting, my voice echoing through the forest, swallowed by the towering pines. There was no answer. A strange feeling crept up my spine, like I was being watched. I checked the ground. Silva's footprints were there, leading away from camp. I followed them, stepping carefully so I wouldn't disturb the pattern. They moved in a straight line toward the dense trees, and then they just stopped. I blinked, looked again. The ground was covered in soft dirt and scattered pine needles. His footprints were clear, deep. Then suddenly, they vanished, as if he had been lifted into the air. I swallowed hard. It didn't make sense. For the next few hours, I searched. I traced circles around the area, calling his name, listening for any sound. I checked the river nearby, the rocky slope we had climbed the day before. Nothing. It was like he had never been there at all. The forest felt different now. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant sound of running water. Just stillness. I told myself it was my imagination, that Silva had just wandered too far and I would find him soon. But the feeling in my chest, tight cold, told me something was wrong. The sun started sinking behind the peaks. Shadows stretched across the ground, twisting between the trees. My stomach churned. I had to make a choice. I could stay another night and keep searching. But if Silva was lost, he might already be moving down the mountain, trying to find his way back. If I waited here, I might lose my only chance to get help. I packed up what I could carry and started down the trail. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees. I kept looking back, half expecting Silva to come running out of the woods, laughing, telling me it was all a joke. But no one came. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sky was dark. I stumbled inside, out of breath, my clothes damp with sweat. The officer at the desk looked up, surprised by my appearance. "My friend," I gasped. "He's missing." The words felt heavy. Real. The officer's expression turned serious. He grabbed a clipboard, asked me questions, where I last saw Silva, what he was wearing, how long he had been gone. I answered everything I could, my mind racing. Then he said something that made my skin go cold. "You're not the first," he muttered, almost to himself. I frowned. "What?" The officer hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. We'll send a team up first thing in the morning." I wanted to argue, to beg them to go right then. But the way he looked at me, like he already knew how this would end, kept me quiet. I spent the night in town, lying awake in a cheap motel bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind howled. It almost sounded like someone calling my name. 2 weeks later, Silva came back. But he wasn't Silva anymore. I didn't expect the knock. It was late, past midnight, and the streets outside were dead silent. I had been sitting in the dark, half asleep on my couch, the glow of the TV flickering in the empty room. When I heard the knock, slow and deliberate, my stomach tightened. No one ever visited this late. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the door. Then the knock came again. I got up, my legs feeling oddly unsteady, and approached the door. Peering through the peephole, I felt my breath catch in my throat. Silva. He stood on my porch, barefoot, wearing the same clothes he had on the day he disappeared. His jacket was torn, his jeans smeared with dirt. His face was pale, almost sickly, but he was smiling, this weird, small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I yanked the door open, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "Silva." My voice came out hoarse, like I hadn't spoken in hours. "Hey, man," he said, like he had just come back from a quick trip to the store. I stared at him, unable to move. 2 weeks. He had been gone for 2 weeks. Search teams had scoured the mountains. People assumed he was dead. And now, here he was, standing in my doorway, like nothing had happened. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. "Where the hell have you been?" Silva let out a soft chuckle and rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a long story," he said. "Mind if I come in?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't want him here, but because something about him, something I couldn't quite name, made my skin prickle. But this was Silva, my best friend. I stepped aside. "Yeah, of course," I said. "Come in." Silva walked past me, moving with a strange, slow grace. I shut the door and turned to face him. He was looking around the living room, taking everything in like he was seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on the framed photos on the bookshelf, the clutter on the coffee table. "It's good to be back," he murmured. I didn't know what to say. My brain was still trying to catch up, to make sense of this. "Dude, we thought you were dead," I finally said. "Where have you been? What happened?" Silva turned to me and smiled again. The same small, unreadable smile. "I don't really remember," he said. "One minute I was hiking, the next, I don't know. I woke up near the trailhead." I frowned. "That's it? That's all you remember?" He nodded. "Yeah, it's all kind of blurry." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I looked him over more closely. His skin was pale, almost grayish under the dim light. There was dirt caked under his fingernails, but his hands didn't look scratched or bruised, like you'd expect from someone lost in the wilderness for 2 weeks. And his eyes were darker than I remembered. Not just tired, darker. I tried to shake the feeling crawling up my spine. This was Silva. He was safe. He was here. That's what mattered. "You should sit down," I said. "I'll get you some water." Silva nodded and lowered himself onto the couch with that same slow, deliberate movement. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a glass, and filled it with water. My hands were shaking slightly. When I came back, Silva was staring at the TV, which was still playing an old horror movie on mute. The flickering light cast strange shadows on his face. I handed him the glass. He took it, but he didn't drink. He just held it in his hands, looking down at the water like he wasn't sure what to do with it. "Are you okay?" I asked. He looked up at me, and for a second, I felt something cold press against the back of my mind, a strange and sudden sensation, like the feeling you get when you wake up from a nightmare and can't remember why you were afraid. Then he smiled again. "I'm fine," he said. "Just tired." I forced a laugh, trying to shake the tension in my chest. "Yeah, I bet. You can crash here tonight. You need rest, man." Silva nodded. "Yeah, I think I do." I watched him for a moment longer. He still hadn't taken a sip of the water. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but something was wrong. I just didn't know how bad it was going to get. I wanted to believe Silva was just tired, that his strange behavior was nothing more than the result of being lost in the mountains for 2 weeks. But the more time I spent with him, the more I knew something was wrong. It started with the small things. The way he moved, for one. Silva had always been quick and full of energy, always fidgeting or stretching like he couldn't sit still. But now he was still, too still. When he sat on my couch, he barely shifted. His posture was too straight, like someone had placed him there, like a mannequin that didn't know how to relax. And then there was his blinking, or rather, the lack of it. I didn't notice at first, but after a while, it became impossible to ignore. We'd be watching TV, and I'd glance over at him. He'd be staring at the screen, eyes wide, unblinking. I'd count the seconds. 10, 15, 20. Still nothing. It made my skin crawl. But the worst part, the way he looked at me. Silva had always been expressive. If he was annoyed, you knew it. If he was excited, he'd light up like a kid. But now there was something off about his eyes. When he looked at me, it was too focused, too deep. Not in a thoughtful way. More like he was studying me. Like he was trying to remember how to act normal. One night, I decided to test it. I sat across from him at the dinner table. He was chewing slowly, too slowly, like he had to remind himself what to do with food. I took a deep breath. "Silva," I said, "how's the food?" He looked at me, his fork pausing midair. Then he smiled. A perfect, empty smile. "It's good," he said. His tone was fine. Normal, even, but something about it made my stomach twist. It was like he was mimicking the right answer, like an actor who had learned the lines but didn't understand their meaning. I decided to push further. "What do you remember from the mountains?" Silva's smile faded. He put his fork down, slowly, deliberately. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he exhaled, long and slow. "It's blurry," he said, "like a dream." I watched him carefully. His face was calm. Too calm. "You don't remember anything?" He shook his head. "No." Silence stretched between us. The air in the room felt heavier somehow. The hum of the fridge, the faint ticking of the clock. Everything seemed distant. And then Silva did something that made my blood run cold. He blinked. Not once, but 3 times in a row. Too fast. Too deliberate. Like he had just realized he should be blinking and overcorrected. I felt my hands go clammy under the table. Something was pretending to be my friend, and it was getting better at it. I didn't notice it at first. Not really. Max had always been a friendly dog. He loved people, always running up to guests, sniffing them, wagging his tail. But ever since Silva came back, something had changed. At first, I thought Max was just being cautious. He would stare at Silva from a distance, ears pinned back, tail lowered. But then it got worse. Now every time Silva enters the room, Max growls. Low, rumbling, a warning. It happens that morning at breakfast. Silva is at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee, moving slow like he's still waking up. I'm sitting at the table, my hands wrapped around my own cup, trying to push through the fog in my head. Max is lying by my feet, quiet, watching. Then Silva turns around, and Max growls again. Silva stops mid-step. His head tilts slightly, like he's listening to something I can't hear. Then he smiles, but it doesn't reach his eyes. Your dog doesn't like me anymore, he says, his voice calm. I let out a nervous chuckle, scratching the back of my head. I think he's just adjusting. You were gone for 2 weeks, man. Maybe you smell different. Silva's smile lingers for a second too long. He takes another step forward. Max stands up immediately, ears flat against his skull. The growl deepens, turning into something closer to a snarl. I've had Max for 6 years. I've never seen him act like this. Whoa, hey, I say, putting a hand on his back to calm him down. He's tense, muscles tight like he's ready to spring. Silva watches him for a moment, then slowly steps back. The second he does, Max stops growling, but his body stays rigid, his eyes locked onto Silva like he's tracking something I can't see. Something about it makes my stomach twist. Silva finally lets out a small chuckle, shaking his head. I guess I can't blame him, he says, turning back to his coffee. Animals always know, don't they? The words make me freeze. It's something about the way he says it. Not like a joke. Not even like an observation. Like a fact. A cold, certain fact. A chill spreads across my skin, but I force a laugh. Yeah, I guess so. Silva lifts his cup to his lips and takes a slow sip. I notice, for the first time, that his hands don't look quite right. The fingers are longer than I remember. Just slightly. Like a trick of the light. I shake it off. Max stays by my side for the rest of the day, never leaving the room when Silva is in it. That night, when I go to bed, he jumps on a mattress with me. Something he never does. I let him stay. At around 3 a.m., I wake up to a sound. A low, throaty growl. Max. He's sitting up, staring at the closet door. The room is dark, but the way he's watching it, his whole body tense, lips curled back, makes my skin prickle. I swallow hard and turn my head toward the closet. The door is open. Just an inch. I don't remember leaving it that way. My breath catches in my throat. My fingers grip the blanket. The air in the room feels wrong, thicker somehow, pressing against my skin. Then, from somewhere inside the closet, something shifts. A soft, almost inaudible creak. Max lets out another growl, deep and low. His body shakes, but he doesn't move from his spot. I don't move either. I just lie there, frozen, staring at that tiny gap in the door. And then, from the other side of the room, I hear Silva's voice. You should keep the dog outside. I flinch. My head snaps toward my bedroom door, and there he is, standing in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. Just standing there, watching. His voice is quiet, smooth. Dogs are too smart, he says. Then he turns and walks away. I don't sleep for the rest of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling anymore. Something was wrong with Silva. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting my fear twist reality. But the way he moved, the way he spoke, it was all just slightly off, like a poorly rehearsed version of the man I used to know. And then there were the moments I caught him watching me, his expression unreadable, his lips slightly parted, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. I needed proof. That night, I set up an old camcorder on the shelf across from my bed. I told myself it was just to ease my mind, to show myself there was nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Silva had gone to his room earlier than usual. No good night, no small talk, just a lingering glance before he shut the door. It made my skin crawl. I locked my own door, something I had never done before, and slid under the covers, pretending I wasn't terrified. Sleep didn't come easy. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The pale light of dawn filtered through the blinds, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Then I remember the camera. My heart pounded as I sat up and grabbed it. The battery was nearly dead, but it had recorded all night. I pressed play. At first, it was just me, tossing and turning in bed. The hours passed in a blur of static and dim moonlight. Nothing strange. No movement. No reason to be afraid. And then, around 3:14 a.m., my bedroom door opened. I froze. The door hadn't creaked. It had simply swung open, slow and deliberate. Silva stepped inside. He didn't move like a person entering a room. He moved like a shadow sliding across the floor, smooth, effortless. He was barefoot, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening. I watched as he stopped at the foot of my bed and stood there. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood, watching me sleep. A full minute passed. Then 2. Then 5. I could see my own body in the footage, chest rising and falling in steady breaths, completely unaware of the figure looming over me. 10 minutes. 15. 20. I gripped the camera tighter. My breath was shallow, my hands cold. Silva didn't move an inch the entire time. And then, without warning, his head snapped toward the camera. Not turned. Snapped. As if he had just become aware of it. I nearly dropped the camcorder. He wasn't looking at my sleeping self anymore. He was staring directly at the lens. Directly at me. His eyes were too dark, too empty. His lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. And then, at exactly 3:37 a.m., he walked backward out of the room. His body moved in reverse, perfectly smooth, never breaking eye contact with the camera. The door shut behind him without a sound. The video ended. I sat there, trembling, gripping the camcorder so tightly my fingers ached. My mind screamed at me to leave the house, to get away from him. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on my bedroom door. I held my breath. A voice followed. Calm. Almost amused. Noah, Silva said from the other side. I know you're awake. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong with Silva. It wasn't just the strange way he moved, the eerie way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't even the fact that he had stood in my room all night, unmoving. It was something deeper, something I couldn't explain, so I started looking for answers. I sat at my desk. The glow of my laptop screened the only light in the darkened room. The house felt cold, quieter than usual. Even Max, my dog, had retreated under the bed, refusing to come out. I typed into the search bar, disappearances in the Cascade Mountains. At first, it was just news reports. Lost hikers, missing campers. Some were found, most weren't. The mountains were dangerous. People got lost all the time. But the deeper I dug, the stranger the stories became. There were accounts dating back decades. People who vanished for weeks, only to return different. Families described them as distant, detached, as if something had hollowed them out and left a shell behind. Some refused to speak about what had happened. Others never spoke again at all. And some didn't stay long. There was one case from 1987. A man named Daniel Whitaker disappeared while hunting with friends. He came back 12 days later, unharmed but wrong. His wife said he wouldn't sleep, wouldn't eat. He barely blinked. A week later, he left in the middle of the night, walking back toward the mountains. They found his clothes near a river, neatly folded. They never found him. Another case in 2003. A woman named Julia Hensley went missing while hiking alone. 2 weeks later, she knocked on her parents' front door, smiling, but something about her was off. She didn't recognize her childhood home. She asked strange questions like, "How long have I been here?" as if she wasn't talking about the 2 weeks she was gone. Then, one morning, she walked into the woods behind her house and vanished. The stories repeated over and over. Gone for 2 weeks. Came back changed. Left again. Never found. I leaned back in my chair, my pulse quickening. Silva had been missing for exactly 14 days. I stared at the screen, my breath unsteady. My gut twisted. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the picture they were forming was something I didn't want to see. I reached for my phone with a shaking hand and dialed Silva's number. It rang twice before he answered. His voice came through the speaker, smooth and calm. "Noah," he said, "why are you calling so late?" I swallowed hard. "Where are you?" A pause. Then, outside. I stiffened. Outside where? A knock came from my front door. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. Slowly, I turned my head toward the door. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard the gate creak or the gravel crunch. But he was there, standing in the darkness, waiting. I lowered the phone from my ear. The call was still connected. From a speaker, Silva's voice whispered, "Come outside." I sat across from Silva in my dimly lit living room. The only sound between us the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The air felt thick, heavy, like a storm was pressing against the walls. I hadn't slept in 2 days, not since I saw the footage of him standing over my bed. My hands shook as I gripped my coffee mug, though I knew caffeine wouldn't help me anymore. Silva, on the other hand, sat perfectly still. He wasn't scrolling through his phone, shifting in his seat, or fidgeting with his hands like he used to. He just sat there, watching me, his dark eyes locked onto mine like I was some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. I couldn't take it anymore. "You're not Silva," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't react right away. For a long moment, he just stared at me, his face completely blank. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his lips. It wasn't warm. It wasn't amused. It was calculated. "Noah," he said, tilting his head slightly. "That's a strange thing to say." His voice was smooth, calm, too calm. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. "I don't know what happened to you out there," I continued, my hands tightening around the mug. "But I know that whatever came back, it's not my friend." Silva let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Come on, man. It's me. I just went through something weird in the mountains, and now you're acting like I'm some kind of... what? A ghost? A demon?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. His smile faded. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His eyes never left mine. "Why do you think that, Noah? What makes you so sure I'm different?" I swallowed hard. "You don't blink enough. You don't sleep. You don't eat. And your voice..." I hesitated, my stomach twisting into knots. "It sounds wrong, like you're trying too hard to sound normal." Silva let out a long sigh and leaned back against the couch. For the first time, he looked almost tired. "You're imagining things." "No, I'm not." Silva was silent. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, rhythmic and slow. He studied me, his expression unreadable. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's say you're right. Let's say I'm not me." My stomach clenched. "What do you think I am?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I had theories, too many of them. Maybe Silva had been replaced by something. Maybe his body was just a shell now, something else wearing his skin like a costume. Maybe he had never really come back at all. Silva leaned in closer, his smile creeping back. "What if I told you that you aren't Noah anymore either?" I flinched. He chuckled, his fingers still tapping against the armrest. "You've been seeing things, haven't you? Shadows moving when they shouldn't. Shapes in the corners of your eyes. Strange dreams. Tell me I'm wrong." I felt cold all over. "You're tired," he continued, his voice barely more than a murmur now. "Maybe you've been tired for a long time. Maybe that's why you're forgetting things. Maybe that's why you don't feel quite like yourself anymore." I clenched my fists. "Shut up." His smile widened. "Noah, are you sure you're still you?" Something inside me snapped. I shot to my feet, the coffee mug slipping from my grip and shattering against the floor. "Get out." Silva didn't move. He just watched me, unblinking. "Come on, man. Get out." I shouted, my voice shaking. He stood up slowly, deliberately. He was taller than me, just slightly, but right now, it felt like he was looming. His shadow stretched strangely in the dim light. Too long, too dark. "You'll see," he murmured. "Soon." And then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. I stood there, my breathing ragged, my hands trembling at my sides. It was only after the door clicked shut that I realized I hadn't told him about the shadows. I hadn't told him about the dreams. And yet, he knew. I don't sleep much anymore. It's not just because of Silva. It's everything. The air in my house feels different, thicker, heavier, like it's pressing down on me. The silence at night isn't really silence. It hums. It whispers. I keep telling myself it's my imagination, that I'm just paranoid, but I know better. Something is wrong. I started keeping my bedroom door locked. That doesn't stop him, though. Every night, I hear him moving. His footsteps are too slow, too measured, like he's walking just to remind me that he's still there. And sometimes, he just stops outside my door. I can hear his breathing, soft and steady. Too steady. Last night, I swear I heard him say my name. Not out loud. Not in any way I can explain. It was just in my head, like a thought that wasn't mine. I don't respond. I don't move. I keep my eyes shut tight and pretend I'm asleep. And eventually, he walks away. The shadows aren't right. During the day, Silva acts almost normal. Almost. He sits at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone like he used to. But I've noticed something. He never blinks when he's looking at the screen. Not once. I tested it. I watched him out of the corner of my eye for a full 5 minutes, waiting, counting. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to say something, he turned his head toward me so fast I nearly flinched. His lips curled into that strange, too perfect smile. "You're staring, Noah." I laughed it off, made up some excuse. But the way he watched me after that, it wasn't normal. It wasn't him. And it's not just him anymore. The house is different. Shadows stretch a little too far. Corners seem deeper than they should be. I catch glimpses of movement where there shouldn't be any. I turn my head, and nothing's there. But I know I saw it. And the worst part, the reflections. Yesterday, I was brushing my teeth when I noticed something off in the mirror. My reflection moved just a fraction of a second too late. Just a tiny, tiny delay. My stomach turned to ice. I stood there, staring at myself. I lifted my hand. My reflection did the same. At the same time, I leaned forward. So did it. Then I took a step back. For half a second, just half a second, my reflection stayed where it was before snapping back into place. I ran out of the bathroom, heart pounding. Silva was waiting in the hallway. "You okay?" he asked. His head was tilted, just slightly like he was studying me. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. His smile widened. "Good. Losing time. I don't know how much longer I can pretend this is fine. I keep losing time. I'll be working on my laptop. Then suddenly it's dark outside, and I don't remember the past few hours. I found my phone in the fridge yesterday. My car keys in the bathtub. And last night, I woke up outside. I don't know how I got there. 1 second, I was in bed. The next, I was standing barefoot in the backyard, shivering in the cold, the wet grass clinging to my feet. Silva was standing at the back door, watching me. "You were sleepwalking," he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. I didn't respond. I was too busy staring at his feet. He wasn't standing on the porch. He was just above it, half an inch off the ground. A shiver crawled up my spine. I blinked, and suddenly, his feet were flat on the wood. My breath caught in my throat. "You should go back inside," he said. "You don't want to stay out here too long." I don't remember walking back inside. I don't remember going back to bed. But when I woke up this morning, there was dirt in my sheets. And Silva was sitting at the kitchen table, watching me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I don't remember when the fear first started to sink in. It wasn't all at once, but a gradual shift. At first, it was just little things, oddities that I could chalk up to stress, to the kind of nerves that come from being stuck in a place you don't understand. But now, as I stood there in the middle of the night, it was clear to me. Something was terribly wrong with Silva. The air in the house was thick, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on me. I could hear the wind howling outside, the rain beating against the windows. But inside, it was too quiet, almost unnervingly so. My heart was thudding in my chest, and for the first time in days, I felt truly afraid. And that wasn't something I usually felt. I was the one people came to for comfort, the calm one. But right now, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was watching me. I glanced at the clock. 3:02 a.m. I was supposed to be asleep, but I couldn't manage it. I hadn't been able to sleep in days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving in the corners of the room. I saw Silva's face, his face but wrong. The way his mouth curled into that unnatural smile. How his eyes, once so full of life, had become black pits. I had to know. I had to confront him. I walked down the hallway, my feet dragging against the cold floor. My hand gripped the edge of the doorframe as I reached his bedroom. The door was cracked open, just a sliver, but the darkness beyond it felt suffocating. I pushed it open slowly, careful not to make sound. And that's when I saw him. Silva was standing in the middle of the room, perfectly still. He wasn't facing me, but I could feel his eyes on me, piercing, heavy. The only light in the room came from the moon outside, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. His back was to me, but I could tell something was wrong. His posture, so rigid, so unnatural, like a mannequin. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat. Silva. He didn't move, didn't respond. The silence stretched on too long, and my skin prickled with dread. I took another step. Silva. I said again, this time louder. Still nothing. My heart raced. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to run. But I had to know. I had to know. What's happening to you? I whispered, more to myself than to him. Suddenly, he tilted his head, just slightly, and that's when I knew he had been listening. He turned slowly to face me, his face expressionless, but his eyes, those eyes, they were different. No, they weren't his eyes at all. The blackness in them was endless, like a void that pulled in the very light around it. I couldn't look away. I felt myself getting lost in them, like they were sucking me into something dark and cold. And then came that smile. It started at the corners of his mouth, stretching wider and wider, until his lips cracked unnaturally. The sound of it made me shiver. You shouldn't have come, he said in a voice that wasn't his. It was lower, hollow, as though someone was speaking through him, twisting his words into something unrecognizable. Silva, what the hell is going on? I demanded, but my voice felt small, like a whisper against a hurricane. He stepped closer, his feet moving silently across the floor. His movements were fluid, too fluid, like he wasn't bound by the same rules of human motion. The floorboards creaked beneath him, but he didn't seem to notice, or perhaps didn't care. You've been asking the wrong questions, Noah, he said, each word punctuated with a strange, eerie calm. You really shouldn't have come looking for answers. Not when they were never meant for you. I wanted to back away, to turn and run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot. I could feel his presence closing in on me, suffocating me. Silva, my voice cracked, panic rising in my throat. You're not. He took another step, his smile growing even wider, stretching impossibly across his face. He was too close now, too close for comfort. And yet, I couldn't move. I couldn't break free from his gaze. You're not Silva anymore, are you? I whispered, barely able to get the words out. He paused, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. Then, with a sickeningly slow movement, he nodded, the smile never leaving his face. No, he said softly, like he was savoring the words. I am not. That's when I heard it. The soft crack of bone, too loud, too sharp. Silva's face twitched, his features distorting for a split second, his skin stretching unnaturally across his bones. His lips curled back, revealing teeth that were far too long, far too sharp. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows twisted around him like they were alive. Get away from me, I shouted, finally finding my voice. I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, and every step seemed to carry me deeper into the nightmare. I slammed into the doorframe, tried to push past it, but there was something in the air, in the room, holding me in place. A presence that wasn't Silva, but something far worse. And then came the voice again, soft and quiet, but its words sliced through me like a knife. It's too late, Noah. You're already here. I twisted, my breath catching in my throat. Silva, or whatever he had become, was standing just behind me, his face too close, his eyes too wide, too deep. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew was one thing. I had to escape. I had to get out, and I had no idea how. But I wasn't sure there was anywhere left to run. I don't know when I stopped feeling the cold. At first, it was just a shiver, a small thing, a tremor that ran through my spine as I stared at Silva, waiting for an answer. I didn't want to ask the question, but I had to. It burned through my thoughts, pressing on my chest like a weight that wouldn't go away. What happened to you in the mountains, Silva? I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine, distant, hollow, as though I was already talking to a stranger. For a moment, Silva just stared at me. His eyes, those eyes I had known for years, seemed to shimmer in the dim light, black and depthless. I wasn't sure if it was the dimness of the room or something else. Maybe it was the way his pupils dilated unnaturally, making his gaze feel wrong. You don't want to know, Noah, he replied softly, his voice low and almost too calm. I clenched my fists at my sides. The silence between us stretched, pulling taut like a rope about to snap. The longer he stayed silent, the harder it became to breathe. I stepped closer, desperate for him to explain, desperate for something. I need to know. I could feel the words crack as I said them. I need to know what happened to you. Because this, I gestured at him, at the thing that looked like Silva, but wasn't. This isn't you. His lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. Not really. It was something sharper. Something too sharp. His smile stretched wide, wider than it should have. I'm still here, Noah. His words were soothing, but they weren't right. I wanted to turn away, to run out the door, but my legs were rooted to the floor. Silva's gaze pinned me in place, held me like some predator watching its prey. You're not, I whispered, barely able to form the words. You're not Silva. He tilted his head slightly, and I noticed how stiff his neck was. The way his head didn't quite bend, the sharp lines of his jaw tight and unnatural. He was too still. I've always been here, Noah. I've always been your friend. But the mountain. He paused, and the air seemed to hold its breath with him. I waited, hardly daring to move. The silence pressed in like a weight against my chest. The mountain changed me, Silva continued, his voice lowering to a near whisper. You've heard the stories. People go into those woods. They disappear. Sometimes they come back, but they're never the same. A cold chill ran down my spine. I'd heard the stories, of course. The missing people, the whispers in the woods, the legends of things that lived between the trees, things that waited for the lonely and the lost. But I never believed them. Not really. Change how? I asked, though I wasn't sure if I even wanted to know. Silva's smile widened. The mountains keep you. They keep you longer than you realize. And when you leave, you're not really leaving. I backed up, my heart hammering in my chest. What do you mean by that? What are you trying to say? For the first time, I saw something in his expression, a flicker of anger, or maybe something darker. The way his face shifted, like he was trying to hold on to something he couldn't quite grasp. It was like he was tearing himself apart from the inside, and I could see in the way his skin stretched across his skull, in the way his fingers curled slightly inward, as if they couldn't quite keep their shape. I am here, Noah, he said, and his voice dropped even lower, almost inaudible. But I never left. Not really. I am the one who came back, but I didn't come back alone. I brought something with me. Something from the dark places. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach, knocking the wind out of me. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like I was frozen, paralyzed by something invisible that held me in place. You're lying. I spat, but the words sounded empty, even to me. This isn't funny, Silva. You're scaring me. He tilted his head again, the motion too fluid, too fast. His neck cracked audibly, and I flinched. I'm not lying, he whispered, and this time, his voice wasn't just wrong, it was other. It was darker, deeper, something that didn't belong to a human. I'm not Silva. I haven't been for a long time. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The walls pressed closer, and the shadows in the corners grew long and twisted, stretching toward me like they had a mind of their own. I could feel the weight of them, heavy and suffocating, crawling up my skin. No, I gasped, stumbling back. No, you can't be. You knew, Noah, he said softly, his eyes glinting. You knew when you saw me. That's why you keep asking. You're not sure anymore, are you? You don't know if I'm still your friend. But I am. I am. The words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I was no longer sure if I was talking to Silva, or if I was talking to whatever had become Silva. He stepped closer, his movements unnaturally smooth, like he was gliding, not walking. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but my body refused to obey. His presence was suffocating. He was so close now that I could smell the damp earth in his clothes, the forest hanging off him like a cloak. I never left, Noah. I just changed. His voice was barely a whisper, but it was all I could hear. And then, as if the last pieces of his mask had slipped away, I saw it. Something flickered beneath his eyes. Something ancient. Something that had never been human. The truth slammed into me like a wave, too powerful to ignore. Silva wasn't back. Whatever had taken him in the mountains had returned, and it was wearing his skin. I can't explain what happened next. It's all a blur, but I remember the suffocating weight of fear that pressed against my chest, and the way my heart thundered in my ears. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body was moving on its own, just trying to get away, but every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't escape. Silva wasn't Silva anymore. He was something else. Something darker. Something wrong. I stumbled out of the house, the cold night air biting into my skin. The woods stretched out before me. Dark, vast, endless. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to run. I needed distance. I needed to be as far from him as possible. But Silva followed. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps too soft, too precise, like he knew exactly where I was at all times. I dared a quick glance over my shoulder. I shouldn't have. His shape was there, standing at the edge of the woods, just barely visible in the shadows. But it wasn't the way a person should stand. He was still, unnaturally still, his form flickering, shifting, as though the dark itself was clinging to him. His eyes glinted in the dim moonlight, black, like empty pits. And when he smiled, his mouth stretched too wide, far too wide, until it almost seemed to rip open. I couldn't scream. My throat felt raw, choked with terror. But I kept running, my breath shallow, my legs heavy. I heard him move, and it was impossible to tell how. One moment, he was at the edge of the woods. The next, he was right behind me. His presence was like a shadow crawling beneath my skin, wrapping around me, tightening. And then I felt it, the cold. Not just the cold of the night, but something deeper, something older. I froze, my body locking up, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could hear his voice then, low and guttural, just behind me, like it was coming from the earth itself. "You can't run from me, Noah," he said. His voice was wrong, distorted, but I recognized it. It was Silva's voice, but not. It was twisted, layered with something ancient, something vile. I turned to face him. I couldn't help myself. He was standing there, just a few feet away, watching me with that impossible smile, his eyes glowing in the darkness. "I'm not running from you," I said, my voice barely a whisper, more to myself than to him. My hands were shaking, but I was done running. I was done pretending that I didn't know what was happening. "You already are," he replied, his grin widening. I needed to get out. I needed to survive. The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. Fire. The legend. Fire could stop them. I had to find a way to create fire. Anything to keep him away. I turned and bolted through the trees, barely noticing where I was going. The woods closed in around me, the branches scratching at my skin, the leaves crunching underfoot. I had no plan, no real idea of what I was doing, but my body moved like it had a mind of its own. Desperation had taken over, and it was all I could do to keep running, to keep moving. Then, finally I saw it. A pile of dry wood, scattered around a small clearing. Probably someone's campfire from long ago. The realization hit me like a wave. I grabbed the nearest sticks, piling them together, fingers trembling as I snapped off twigs and gathered leaves. But then I heard it. His voice. "Closer now. You can't escape me." I looked up, and there he was, Silva. No, not Silva, but it, standing in the clearing just a few feet away. I could see the unnatural twitching of its fingers, the way its head tilted just slightly to the side, as if studying me. It moved like a predator, slow and deliberate, as though savoring my fear. The pile of wood was ready, but I didn't have anything to light it with. I dug into my pockets in a panic, fumbling through them. Nothing. I was running out of time. Silva, it stepped closer, and the air around me seemed to thicken. My vision blurred. I couldn't let it get any closer. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans, and for a moment, I thought I had nothing left. Then I felt it. The matches. A single match. I struck it against the rough edge of the box, and it flared to life in my hand. The tiny flame flickered weakly, barely enough to catch the dry wood. My hands shook as I brought the match closer to the pile, the flame struggling to grow. I could hear Silva's breath, deep, slow, almost like it was waiting. The moment I dropped the match into the pile, the fire ignited with a whoosh, the heat blazing in front of me. Silva, it stopped in its tracks. The shadows that clung to its form seemed to hiss, recoiling from the flame. "You think fire can stop me?" it whispered, but the words were filled with a kind of doubt, like it wasn't sure anymore. It stepped back, but the way it moved wasn't right. Its body flickered, stretching and distorting, as though its very form couldn't hold together. The fire grew larger, brighter, and with it, a sense of power that I hadn't felt before. I backed away, my heart still racing, eyes glued to the fire. Silva, I didn't even want to think of it as Silver anymore, stood just outside the flame's reach, glaring at me with those hollow eyes. For a moment, I thought it might charge, that it might try to break through the fire, but then it stopped. "You can't run forever," it said, and I thought I saw something in its eyes, a flicker of what was once human. Or maybe that was just my mind playing tricks on me. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran again, pushing myself harder, faster. The fire was still there, a protective barrier behind me, but I didn't dare slow down. I couldn't. I wasn't sure if the fire would hold it back. I wasn't sure if I would make it out alive. But as long as I was running, I had one thing to hold on to, a hope. And hope, in a place like this, was the only thing that could keep me alive. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and my chest felt heavy, like I was suffocating on the weight of my own fear. I ran, my feet stumbling over jagged rocks, the forest around me closing in, dark and suffocating. Silva, if that thing even still was Silva, was behind me, moving faster than I thought was humanly possible. I could hear his footsteps, but they didn't sound like they should. They were too light, too fast. And then there was the sound of something else, something wrong, like claws scraping against bark. Like the air itself was bending to follow him. I had to keep running. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where I was, but I knew one thing. If I stopped, it was over. Whatever he had become, whatever had taken him, was coming for me. And if it caught me, I'd disappear just like he had. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. My legs were burning, but I forced them to move. The trees blurred past me like twisted, skeletal arms reaching out to grab me, to pull me into whatever darkness had swallowed Silva. I could still see him, see that thing, in my peripheral vision, shifting like a shadow, always just behind me. He wasn't running anymore. He was gliding, almost like he wasn't even touching the ground. I tripped over a rock and fell hard, the jagged edge of it scraping my palms raw. Pain flared, but I didn't have time to care. I scrambled to my feet and forced myself forward again, breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced, desperate for a way out, desperate for anything that would stop this nightmare. That's when I remembered the old stories, the ones I'd read in a panic before heading back into the woods. There had been a legend, a faint whisper in the records I'd found, a myth about creatures that could wear human skins, that could take a body and live in it until it was no longer recognizable. There was only one thing that could stop them: fire. I glanced around. There was nothing but the trees and the darkness closing in. No time to find anything. But then my eyes caught something, a flicker of light in the distance. A campfire, a small spark, like a dying ember, but still there. My heart skipped. I turned toward it, my legs moving on their own now. I didn't care if it was a trap. It didn't matter. It was the only chance I had. I reached the fire just as Silva stepped into view, blocking the path between me and it. He was smiling, but his face didn't move quite right. His eyes were dark, too dark, like endless pits of night, and there was something in them that made my stomach churn. Something old, something hungry. "You can't escape, Noah," Silva said. His voice was wrong. It sounded like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other, all whispering through his teeth. "You should have stayed away. Now you're just like me." I felt a cold sweat on my neck as I backed away. My eyes darted around, searching for something to fight with, but there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire. My breath caught in my throat. I had no choice. "You're not Silva," I said, my voice shaking. "You're not him anymore." Silva's grin widened, and I swear, his teeth were sharper than they should have been. "No," he agreed, stepping closer, his body twitching unnaturally. "I'm better than I've ever been." I couldn't think. My fingers fumbled as I reached for a branch that lay near the fire. It was thin, brittle, but it would have to do. I shoved it into the flames, watching it catch. The heat rushed up into my face, making my skin feel like it was burning off. But I didn't care. I swung it at Silva, holding the flaming end out in front of me, hoping to drive him back. He stopped, his eyes flicking to the fire. His expression twisted. It was like he was studying it, like he wasn't sure how to react. For a moment, There was something almost human about the look in his eyes, like a spark of recognition. But then the darkness took over again. "That won't stop me," he said, his voice low and full of something that wasn't fear, but something worse. "I'm already inside you, Noah. I've been here since you found me. You can't outrun it." I swung the branch at him again, harder this time, the flames licking the air, casting eerie shadows on the trees around us. The fire was my only weapon, and it was all I had left. My heart thundered as Silva moved closer, his body unnaturally still, but his eyes burning with an intensity that made the blood in my veins run cold. "You'll see," Silva said, his voice almost a whisper now, like a promise. "You'll see what happens when you stop running. You'll be just like me. I'll help you, Noah. I'll make you strong." I pushed the branch toward him, desperate. His face contorted in something between a laugh and a snarl, and for the first time, I thought I saw it, whatever it was that had taken him, behind his eyes. Before I could move, Silva lunged, faster than I could react. I felt a searing pain across my chest as his hand shot out, the force of it knocking the branch from my grip. The fire sputtered, dying in the chaos. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my heart in my throat. Silva's face was inches from mine, his breath cold and stale. His lips barely moved as he whispered in my ear, "You're already mine." And then, with a sudden shift, he stopped. The ground beneath us seemed to shift too, the shadows growing deeper, the forest warping, like it was alive and trying to swallow us whole. Silva's body flickered, shifting out of focus, and then like a wave crashing in reverse, he was gone. I stood there, frozen, my heart racing as the silence pressed in. The fire had gone out completely, leaving nothing but darkness. My mind reeled. Had it all been a dream? No, I knew better. I had to keep moving. But when I turned to run, the sound of Silva's voice followed me, distant and cold. "I'll be waiting," he said. "I'll always be waiting." And somewhere deep in the woods, I thought I heard him laughing. "I'm awake, but I'm not sure how long I've been here. The fire has burned down to little more than glowing embers. The mountain air is thin, biting my lungs with every breath. My hands tremble as I grip the edges of the makeshift fire circle I managed to create, though I'm not sure how I even did it anymore. I just remember the panic, the instinct to survive. Silva's gone now. Or, I think he is. I haven't seen him in hours, but I can feel him. Something is watching me from just beyond the light. It's like the woods have eyes, thousands of them, hidden in the dark. I've heard things in the silence, whispered voices that aren't mine, but they sound like they know me, like they've always known me. The fire crackles, and I can almost make out a shape standing in the shadows, just outside the circle of warmth. I don't look directly at it. I don't want to see it. If I don't look at it, maybe it can't see me. My heart hammers in my chest, the sound of it deafening in my ears. Silva's face flashes in my mind, his twisted smile. The way he moved, too fast, too fluid, like something that didn't belong in this world. But what terrified me more than anything was the way he looked at me when he whispered those final words. "It's too late. It's already inside you." I've tried to shake that off, to tell myself it was just his madness, his possession. But deep down, a part of me knows. I can feel it, crawling inside me like a sickness, a thing that wasn't there before. A weight I can't lift. The woods around me are still, too still. No wind, no rustling leaves. It's like the entire forest is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Or maybe I am, waiting for me to be something I don't want to be. I don't know how long I've been sitting here, in this lonely circle of firelight, trying to pretend I'm safe. I'm not. I know that now. There's no escaping this. Silva wasn't the first. He wasn't the last. I closed my eyes, only for a moment, just long enough to let my thoughts catch up. I see his face again. His eyes. Those black, hollow pits that swallowed everything I thought I knew. And I hear him, too, even though he's gone. "I'm still here, Noah." I jump at the sound of my name. It's not just a memory. It's real. I know it is. I turn around quickly, my breath catching in my throat. The woods are silent, empty, but the voice still echoes in my skull. Something shifts behind me. I don't turn. I can't. It's too late. I've been marked, I realize now. I've become the thing I fear the most, the thing I never saw coming. It's inside me, wearing my skin, and I've known it since I woke up after the fire. I shouldn't have made it out. I shouldn't have survived. But I did. And now, I can feel it. Feel them. That presence that was once Silva, now bleeding into me, spreading through my veins like a shadow that won't die. My reflection, the one I saw in the mountain stream a few hours ago, wasn't mine anymore. It was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew. I knew then. I didn't just escape. I became it. I became them. The fire's glow flickers in my peripheral vision, casting strange shapes on the rocks. I stand, slowly. The movement feels unnatural, too smooth, like I've forgotten how to walk like a human. But I do it anyway, stepping away from the dying embers. I know where I'm going. I don't know if I can ever go back. If I should. I don't know if I even want to. But I'm drawn to the darkness. There's something out there in the woods. Something waiting for me. It's funny. I used to think I could outrun this. I used to think I could outsmart whatever this thing was that had taken Silva. But I was wrong. I never stood a chance. The mountain, the shadows, they all wanted this. They've always wanted this. And now I'm part of it. I step into the trees, letting the night swallow me whole. I don't look back. I don't need to. There's no turning around anymore. The forest is home now. It's always been home. And deep inside, I hear the whisper again, a voice that sounds too much like my own. Welcome back. I'm not sure if I'm speaking anymore. But I'm not alone. Not anymore.